The 22nd of June, 1941. The German army lunges across the Soviet frontier. Panzer tanks grind over dismantled border posts, while dive bombers scream down on Brest, Minsk, and Lviv. Villages burn in their wake, and behind the armored spearheads march members of the Einsatzgruppen, which are Nazi mobile death squads. Together with local nationalists, they herd Jews and political commissars to their freshly dug graves. Columns of Soviet prisoners stumble west under rifle butts, and the German advance seems unstoppable. Long columns of refugees clog the tracks east as the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, race toward Leningrad and Moscow. Among the forces clearing roads, seizing rail depots, and identifying hostile elements, which also include women and children from the minorities, are local nationalist formations who greet the Nazis not as invaders, but as liberators from Stalin's terror. The most infamous Nazi collaborator in the early days of the invasion into the Soviet Union is Stepan Bandera. Stepan Bandera was born on the 1st of January 1909 in the Ukrainian village of Staryi Uhryniv, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father Andriy was a Greek Catholic priest, and his mother Miroslava was the daughter of a priest and a stay-at-home mum. When Stepan was 5, the First World War reached the valley where they lived. Trenches zigzagged through the orchards, soldiers demanded grain, and schoolrooms closed, so the young Stepan learned from his parents. The 1918 armistice ended First World War, but also meant the end for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, the end of war did not bring peace to Galicia region. In Eastern Europe, many ethnicities were fighting for their freedom and were trying to establish their own state. The Ukrainians were no exception, as they founded the Ukrainian People's Republic. However, the Poles, whose ancient state was restored after the end of the First World War, were also interested in the same territory. Polish troops fought Ukrainian volunteers for control of Lviv, the region's capital, and by 1919, the victorious new Polish Republic absorbed Eastern Galicia. Overnight, the Bandera family became Polish subjects. Polish policemen arrived. The Ukrainian language was suppressed, and a white and red flag replaced the blue and yellow colors of a short-lived independent Ukraine, which Stepan had begun to love. At 15, he joined Plast, a Ukrainian scouting movement that blended camping trips with clandestine lectures on history and self-discipline. Soon afterward, he swore the secret oath of the Ukrainian military organization, an underground league of people who believed petitions would never free their homeland and that only action supported with weapons could redraw borders and help to create an independent Ukraine. In 1927, Stepan Bandera graduated from high school in the town of Staryi and entered the agronomy faculty of the Lviv Polytechnic University. Lecture halls could not hold him. After dark, he slipped out to attic rooms where older conspirators taught him how to forge documents, mix invisible ink, and memorize passwords. At first, he distributed leaflets urging students to boycott official ceremonies organized by Polish authorities. Soon, however, he was participating in far more sinister activities, and he never finished his studies because of his involvement in the nationalist movement. February 1929 saw the birth of a larger, more disciplined network, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or the OUN. At only 20, Bandera entered as a foot soldier yet rose through the ranks with startling speed. He was dealing with the propaganda of the movement and also traveled by night train under false names, spoke in cramped village halls, and built courier lines that carried letters from the Carpathians to the Baltic coast. His followers not only painted Polish government buildings with tar and sabotaged telephone poles, but also attacked local politicians. When 2 militants murdered the Polish deputy Tadeusz Hołówko in 1931, Bandera allegedly ordered church bells to be rung across Lviv to cast the killers as martyrs, as they were sentenced to death as murderers and terrorists. Violence in the interwar Poland intensified. Ukrainian nationalists robbed post office safes to fund weapons and money, detonated bombs at official exhibitions, and staged boycotts against state shops. The climax came on the 15th of June 1934, when an OUN gunman shot Poland's Interior Minister Bronisław Pieracki. Bandera was arrested in Lviv and tried regarding his involvement in the plot to assassinate Pieracki, and also for being an OUN leader. He was convicted of terrorism and sentenced to death, but the death sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939 from the west and the Soviet Union attacked on the 17th of September from the east, Poland collapsed in a matter of weeks. According to one story, Bandera escaped from prison after it was abandoned by the guards. According to the other, he was released from prison. One way or the other, Bandera moved first to Lviv, but after realizing it would be occupied by the Soviets, he moved to Kraków, the capital of Germany's occupational general government, where officers of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, saw potential in any group prepared to fight the Soviet Union in the foreseeable future. Bandera, using the codename Konsul II, cooperated with the Abwehr. His goal was to run diversion activities against the Soviet Union after Germany's attack. In 1940, the OUN split. Another leader of the OUN, Andriy Melnik, led a cautious wing that sought German goodwill through diplomacy. Younger militants rallied to Bandera, forming what became the OUN-B, named after him. Both factions preached radical nationalism and shared anti-Semitic slogans, but Bandera demanded swift revolution. During his cooperation with Nazi Germany, he drafted plans for mobile groups of 5 to 15 volunteers who would follow German troops, raise Ukrainian flags, and seize local administrations the moment Soviet rule collapsed. To finance the effort, he accepted Nazi money and charmed German officials with promises of sabotage behind Red Army lines. During his time in Kraków, Bandera got married with Yaroslava Oparivska. She was also a member of the OUN, and they had 3 children. Between his release from a Polish jail in 1939 and Germany's attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941, Bandera's faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN-B, cooperated closely with German military intelligence. Before start of the war, in August 1939, the Abwehr created a 120-man sabotage unit codenamed Bergbauernhilfe. They were recruited from Bandera's followers and trained for operations against Poland. The goal of this unit was to erode Polish defenses by conducting a terror campaign directed at Polish farmers and Jews. After Bandera resettled in German-occupied Kraków, his relationship with the Nazis deepened. In spring 1941, Bandera held meetings with the heads of Germany's intelligence regarding the formation of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions. During this time, the OUN received 2.5 million Reichsmarks for subversive activities inside the Soviet Union. Stepan Bandera assured the Germans that these units, together with small mobile groups already infiltrating Soviet territory, would secure German lines of advance as soon as the frontier was crossed. This arrangement positioned his movement as an auxiliary partner in Hitler's Eastern campaign even before the start of Operation Barbarossa, which was the code name for the German invasion of the Soviet Union. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. As panzer tanks rolled east, Bandera's mobile groups crossed the front line. On the 30th of June, in freshly captured Lviv, members of Bandera movement proclaimed a sovereign Ukrainian state. OUN-B militias wearing matching armbands began arresting Jews and suspected Soviet collaborators. These activities ended in violent pogroms. There is no evidence that Bandera, still in Kraków, actively supported or participated in the Lviv pogroms or acts of violence against Jewish and Polish civilians. But he was well informed about the violence and was unable or unwilling to instruct Ukrainian nationalist military units to protect minorities. His activities regarding Ukrainian independence were short-lived. German authorities requested the Declaration of Independence to be withdrawn, but Bandera refused. A few days later, Bandera was arrested, held in Berlin, and later sent to the special prisoners block of Sachsenhausen concentration camp. It was a specific type of prison, used for high-profile political prisoners and high-risk escapees. During his imprisonment in the camp, it was possible for Bandera's wife Yaroslava to visit and to keep him in touch with his followers. His relationship with the Germans was not ideal. For example, 2 of his brothers, Alexander and Vasily, were sent to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. In the meantime, units loyal to the OUN-B and Bandera had formed the Ukrainian Insurgent Army UPA in the forests of Volyn and were fighting both Nazis and Soviets, while also massacring Polish and Jewish villagers in a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing. Bandera, thanks to a visit from his wife, managed to get into contact with other OUN-B leaders, and some believe that he was one of the orchestrators of the terror which took place in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. Between 1941 and 1944, the militant wing of the OUN-B translated its slogan, "Ukraine for Ukrainians," into systematic bloodshed. OUN-trained militias helped launch the Lviv pogroms of June and July 1941, in which several thousand Jews were beaten and shot. 2 years later, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, formed and led mostly by OUN-B members, turned on the region's Polish and Jewish minority, coordinating nighttime attacks on farms and church villages across Volhynia and Eastern Galicia. The attacks often took place in such a way that a UPA unit entered the village pretending to be Soviet partisans. The men split up, entered houses, and demanded food from the residents. Meanwhile, the village was surrounded, and all Poles passing through were also detained. In the village of Paroshla, UPA partisans ordered all the inhabitants to lay down and tied them up, under the pretext that they were about to carry out an assault on a nearby German rail transport. And if the village inhabitants were found to be tied up, that would serve as proof for the Germans that the Poles did not cooperate with the UPA in the attack. Not all the inhabitants of Paroshla believed them, since some of them could speak Ukrainian. But being unarmed, they had no choice but to do as they were told. Almost all the Poles in the village were murdered with knives and axes. Old men, women, and children, including a 6-month-old baby who was stuck to a table with knife. Only 12 Poles survived, including a 12-year-old boy named Witold Kołodziński, who suffered a cracked skull from an axe blow. This was also part of Bandera's struggle for Ukrainian independence. In these attacks against the civilian population, it is estimated that 60 to 120,000 civilians were murdered. As the Red Army pushed west in 1944, the Nazis sought the help of any force that might slow the Soviet advance. In September 1944, Bandera walked out of Sachsenhausen concentration camp after promising to direct anti-communist operations. He met other released OUN leaders and drafted plans to fight the Soviet Union. One example was an idea to parachute Ukrainian units to the rear of the advancing Soviet forces and create chaos. Yet collapsing front lines made most schemes irrelevant. After the war, Bandera and his family moved several times around Germany, at that time occupied by Western allies. Soviet and Polish politicians and diplomats demanded his extradition, calling him a terrorist who was responsible for thousands of deaths. American counterintelligence officers disagreed. They considered him extremely dangerous, but also too valuable to hand over to the Soviets, since he knew the Ukrainian underground movement and was a skilled anti-communist fighter. Under a shadow arrangement called Operation Anyface, Washington quietly blocked Polish and Soviet requests. As a result of these activities, Bandera moved a lot in post-war Germany, and at the end he settled in Munich, once a stronghold of the Nazis. Bandera was also working for Ukrainian independence after the end of the Second World War, and the Kremlin wanted his voice silenced. They tried, over the years, to find and kidnap him into the Soviet Union. When Soviet patience finally ran out, the infamous KGB, the intelligence agency of the Soviet Union, sent the young Ukrainian Bohdan Stashinsky to execute Bandera. The KGB trained Stashinsky to use a spray gun that fired a jet of poison gas from a crushed cyanide capsule. The gas was designed to induce cardiac arrest, making the victim's death look like a heart attack. Stashinsky had used the weapon to kill another Ukrainian politician, Lev Rebet, in 1957. On the 15th of October 1959, he used an improved version of the same gas gun to assassinate Stepan Bandera in Munich. This time, the KGB was successful, and the 50-year-old Bandera was killed on the spot. On the 20th of October 1959, Bandera was buried in Munich, and 2 years later his wife and 3 children moved to Toronto in Canada. Bandera is still remembered by many as a Ukrainian national hero. He is mainly seen by this group of people for his struggle for Ukrainian independence, whether in the struggle against Poland or the Soviet Union. This struggle, however, was tied to the suffering of thousands of innocent people and meant an alliance with the monstrous regime of Nazi Germany. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.